Alrighty, so let's start talking about objects. I love talking about objects. The thing is, and let's just go ahead, let me have you set this up, and I'm going to really attempt to slow down and be more clear because I realize that in my rush to get content out, sometimes I miss a couple steps. So my commitment is to get better at that, stopping and making sure I'm clear. So let's set up 017 intro to objects, create the index and the main.js. Don't copy the code over from the mileage. We'll come back to that code later. And then code along with me just for this intro one. And when you're done, do intro to objects. Okay. So in this case, let's just talk a minute about what is an object in JavaScript because so much of JavaScript is actually represented by objects. And when we're going to just start talking about the object because it's a particular data type versus what we've dealt with as primitives. Although with objects, that is also a data type and it is not a primitive. Okay, primitives are, and we went through that list, right? Booleans, strings, numbers, right? And the way that they're stored is their value versus objects which are they're stored in a reference, which we will talk about. I think this one, and if not, we will talk about it. I've already kind of mentioned it before, and I know Todd mentioned it. And understanding that concept is really good because when you're writing the code, I've had that get me a couple of times where I didn't remember that objects are referenced by, um, they're passed by reference, and that term can be confusing. So don't worry, we'll get there. So here's the deal. When we're creating objects, right, we're going to create them, and let's just do it. Let's say my object. Oh, actually, let's declare it, right? My object equals. And in this case, we could actually do just kind of what we did with arrays, where we did a literal. Okay. And a literal is just where we use um, symbols in this case, or not symbols, but characters to represent, literally just create an object. And the reason I say that, and you don't have to type this one, but there is another way where you could say create, and you could say new, okay? And then you could say object. And then you could do some work there. And this is good syntax for later because when we're actually getting more advanced with the way that we create and instantiate and inherent objects, those will become more important. But for today, just use open and close curly brackets, okay? And underneath it, let's just remind ourselves when we were doing arrays because there are some similarities between the two, okay? And if I do console.log and I say type of, right, and I pass it an object, or let's just pass it and I could put this on one line, but I'm going to get lazy here and not, right? And I'm just going to say type of my array, okay? Before, and you may have already looked at it. What do you think is going to output here, right? Let's go over here and look, right? They're both objects. And this is when people see stuff like this, they're like, no wonder JavaScript drives them crazy. But here's the deal, except for primitives, almost everything else, and even sometimes primitives, depending on how you reference them, are objects. And understanding these objects is way important. Okay, so just FYI. Now, would you think this, right? That my array, would it equal to my object? Now remember the difference between just strictly no, it doesn't. And does it because it's a different type of object, right? And even if we do, of course, strictly, it's still false. They're not equal, but they're the same type. Oh, I know, right? Gotta love me some JavaScript. Okay, so just setting the context there. Now let's talk about a little syntax, okay? And I'm gonna actually bring this down. I'm gonna leave that up there in case we want to talk about it because we may. So when we're creating objects, there's and this is the cool thing about objects, is they can represent things that are more complex. Like, when you just create a constant, right? My number equal 9, whatever, right? You're storing a value. very simple value, or you're storing a string, or you're storing a boolean, on and on, undefined null, all those primitives, right? These are primitives. But when you're defining and using objects, you can then give, and this is not the correct syntax yet, but I'm just going to show you keys and values. They're also called properties, right? So you have a key and a value inside the object. So what's the key? Well, the key is the thing that is going to kind of describe what the value is. So if I said name, right, and the value in this case, real, right? Now that's a string. Oh, sorry, not comma. And let's just leave that the way it is for now. Okay, so we have our first property inside of the object. Okay, so let's just move over to DevTools for a minute, right? Since we already have it here, and since it's on the global space, right? I don't have to set a breakpoint. I can just say my object, my OBJ. Okay, so you see how this is it looks different in the DevTools, okay, than an array, than a primitive, right? So like if you were to type my number, right? You can see that difference there. So these are data types. And now if I wanted to say, show me, right, in on my object, then what is the value of name? And that's how you would say it. You would actually say my obj dot name. And then what JavaScript says, oh, the value of that key inside that object is this. Okay. Now there is another way to do it. But I don't, and there's times when you'll use the bracket notation this way, but typically that's only when you're using it in your code in some way. I'll actually give you an example in a little bit of this, but this typically what you're doing is referencing the, you can just do the dot notation. Now, you've seen this dot notation for a while now, right? Um, so this dot notation, and you've seen it other places, like when we did arrays, right? Array dot for each. I mean, we could go on and show you you've been using objects and you didn't even know it. Okay, which is fine. So now let's represent a little more complex data. Let's say, right, age, which is fun, 59. So now we have two properties in that object, right? Hobbies. Now, here's a fun one. You can actually have as the value a an array. Okay, so these values are primitives, right? And now in here, we're going to have a list. Okay, so let's just say coding, running. These are actually things I do. I code a lot and I run a lot and I work out a lot. And I do a lot of other stuff, but okay, we won't go down that rabbit hole yet. All right. So now how do we reference these? Right? So again, I think looking at this, you tell me in DevTools is a little bit easier. Again, since it's on the global context, right? All I have to do is type my OBJ. And so if I type age, we know that one, right? But what happens if I type hobbies? It just shows me the array. Or it, in this case, outputs the contents of the array. And then, just like we've already learned about arrays, I could say, show me the first entry. I could say, show me the second entry, right? 0, 1, 2. So those things are still true, but the syntax, because it's in this case, we have an object, and inside that object is an array. But guess what? We could also have more objects, okay? So I could have, let's see, what would be another object I could do is, hold on. Let's do this one. Okay. So how about my, okay, mobile. And in this case, we'll do another object. Okay. So we could say, right, make, okay, I got a pixel 7, right? OS, Android. Is that right? No, it doesn't look right. So in this case, when we do mobile here, so this is a nested object, okay? So how would we reference that? So just knowing how to reference this stuff is a good place to start, right? So let me go back here. So now my object dot mobile, right, dot make, or dot mobile dot os. This is really handy, and we're going to see this. And I think what we're going to do on the first item in week 9 is actually convert the mileage program over into this. But in order to do that, now we have to talk about functions. And in this case, objects can also, as their values, contain functions. The difference is these functions, we have to write the original way we saw functions, okay, for reasons that we can talk about because you don't always have to do it that way. So I could say, right, my greeting, okay, is a function pass. This isn't, and by the way, the way we talk about this, helps when you, and by the way, this is just syntax you get used to, is you put a comma after each key value pair, okay? So in here, I could say return, right? And I could say, what is up? And I could have a value passed in, which I didn't do here, right? Okay. So now I have a method, which is just a function. Okay. So let's look at that. Let's go ahead and refresh that. Okay. So now how would I call that method? Is I would say my obj, the object dot my greeting, okay? And in this case, it's a function. And look at that, it actually already gives me the output, right? It's showing me the return value, right? So I could pass it in is Joe, right? And then that gets passed in here, and then it gets returned, okay? Now, because I'm returning the value when I'm calling the method, in this case, the function inside of there, and this I know has tripped up a couple of people, right? Just say greeting, let's say equals, right? My object, obj dot my greeting, Jane. Okay, and then I can either console log it at that point, but remember, in this case, it's the same as any other kind of function. If I'm returning it, then that is, I have to return and capture that value if I want to use it somewhere else, because I'm not logging it and doing anything with it here. Okay, so nothing really new except the syntax is different. But you might be wondering, why are we not using arrow functions? By the way, we could. In this particular context, we could. And I'm going to pause it here because I'm going to have you go ahead and commit this, because the next thing I want to talk about is the this variable, which can throw everybody into conniptions, but it's not that bad. Okay, so here's what you want to do is go ahead and commit this with intro. Remember, I gave you the commit message, intro to objects.